Okay, I think almost everyone is back. So we might move on to the next part of the program. I introduced myself, but a couple of the I saw a few new faces that came in late. So I'm Noemi de Clercq, and I work for Flanders Literature. So I'm the coordinator of the European project. And I was also asked, because this is my last performance within the project, that if I would be so kind to moderate a panel, and I'm really happy to be able to do so with these three people. They're two publishers and one author, but maybe it's nicer to let them introduce themselves. So I will start maybe with Aimée, if you have the...
Bom dia. My name is Aimée Felone. I'm a publisher back in London. We publish children's books from the ages of 5 to 15, and our main focus is inclusive children's publishing. We also, 7 months ago, opened an inclusive children's bookshop in the heart of Brixton, which is in South London, for those of you who don't know. And Brixton is an area which is going through gentrification and is an area where there was a strong Afro-Caribbean presence and has been generationally, but they are getting moved out even more so as the years go past. So it was very important for us to open the bookshop in an area where we can best serve our community.
Okay, so I met Aimée at a conference in London, and I was intrigued by the way her new publishing house works. It's a young initiative. It's only 2 years old, so I will be happy to hear more from her later on. And we also have Joana.
I'm Joana Estrela. I'm from Porto, and I'm an author and illustrator. I'm mostly doing picture books and comics. That's it.
Okay, thank you. I saw Joana send me one of her works that, was really interesting from the point also of inclusive books. So she brought it, and we can talk about that later on. And then the third person, I'm really happy also to have a different perspective. So three people from other countries, from the UK, from Portugal, and Chafina lives in the Netherlands. So.
And Moroccan too.
And Moroccan.
Hi, my name is Chafina Bendahman. I'm a publisher, but I think we call ourselves a storytelling platform. It's called Rose Stories. We actually focus on inclusive stories in the beginning, and so we publish books, we make theater, and also next year we will be making our first movie. So to us, storytelling is very key, and a focus on inclusion.
Okay, thank you. Maybe it's an open door, but since this is an opening conference in a country which I'm not really familiar with, about how the libraries work and the publishing houses, we had this great example just now from Orfeo Negro. I think it's a very interesting way of publishing adventures, really good artistic books that are inclusive. So thank you for that, Carla. But maybe I want to start with a question. How important is it actually for children growing up to see themselves reflected in books? I see Aimée is nodding, so maybe can you...
Yeah. I think when I think back to when I first saw myself in literature, I struggle to remember the exact age I was. I remember reading Alice Walker very, very young, when I shouldn't have been reading her. And also Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Purple Hibiscus, I read when I was around 13 or 12. But memories of when I saw myself as a small child, I find quite foggy. And so I then think about the children on the other side who grow up always seeing themselves and don't even think about the fact that they haven't. And I think that's definitely a privilege to grow up always seeing yourself as the main character, maybe even sometimes as the villain, as the hero. You see the possibilities of who you can be. Whereas for children who don't see themselves, you just have to imagine that you were that person. You have to kind of pretend as though the person on the page looks like you or comes from a different or similar familial background to you. And so I think the power of representation and the power of seeing yourself, especially from a very young age, can go on to shape the possibilities of who you can be.
You just mentioned that when you were little, you didn't have a lot of books where you saw yourself represented or none. But what was your favorite book then, actually?
I was a big fan of Matilda. Matilda's Roald Dahl, just because of how strong she was as a female character, and also Miss Honey, I think, as well. I really grew a liking to. I think as a child, I'm an only child, so I have no siblings, and to see Matilda in that same kind of space, it really showed me as well who I could be, as well as Jacqueline Wilson's books. I'm not sure if she's reached over here. But she wrote a lot of books about children within different family circumstances. So children whose parents may have been separated, or there was one story where the mother had passed away, or children in care. And I think those stories by Jacqueline Wilson really shaped who I am.
Thank you. Maybe I'm going to just all three of you ask you the same question, because it's a very crucial one. That's why we're here today and why we're doing the project. Why do you think it is important to have this kind of books? And as an author, how do you relate to that? Because I had a lot of conversations the last 6 years with authors of publishers and different actors in the book sector. Is everybody responsible for making books more inclusive? Or do you have the choice as an author to say, no, like, I just want to write my own stories, or is that being in a way inclusive? So
it's difficult to think about that as an author, because I normally don't set out to make this book about this specific thing. The story comes to me, so I don't really question it a lot. But I think it might be, you might think of it as, if more kinds of authors are on the table, then more stories that are inclusive or that are diverse will come. So diverse authors will come up with diverse books. I think that's a bit like that.
So, but it is a joint responsibility? So even as an author, you feel
if I feel the responsibility to have a book that is
yeah, maybe it's a difficult question.
Not really.
No, yeah. Or is it a responsibility of the publishing houses and the bookstores and the libraries? And
I feel a responsibility to make quality work, and I think it's connected, I guess. But then, I'm not sure. Actually, I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Yeah, no, it's no problem. But later on we can talk about your work, and then it will get more concrete. But let's move on to Chafina and hear what she has to say about how important to see it is for children to see themselves reflected in books. And I asked this to Chafina with a specific side question, because you focus on stories and storytelling and not in particular on books. So can you say it is maybe nowadays children have much more sources where stories come to them than books? And what role, what responsibility has the book sector to play in that?
Well, before I answer your question, I get so nervous when I sit in front of a group. So if you... sometimes it helps to just communicate that with the people in the audience. But I think it wasn't really a choice. It feels like a mission, but like I have to take you back to, I was born in Morocco, in the north of Morocco, like in a really, really small village, like where we still use oil lamps. And I think that there in the 80s or in the 70s even, we didn't have a television. There were no books. My parents both are illiterate. Never ever in their lives have they read a book still until this day. So for us it started in this small room. We lived with my grandmother, and all my uncles had their own room. And my mom, we have 8 children, so we slept all in the same room with one bed and just one closet. And I think what kept us together and kept us warm, because at one time, this sounds so corny, but our goat died and she left 2 babies and they slept in the room too. And it was such a magical, weird upbringing, and with my mother as a key figure, because my father traveled to the Netherlands to work there. In the 70s, but she would keep us alive with her stories every night again. And my mom she's never studied, but such an inspiration with telling stories. She would tell us stories about a young woman that lost her mother and ended up with 2 stepsisters, and she was covered in ashes. I've never heard about Cinderella, but that was even there in Morocco, in the north of Morocco, in that small village, that was a story that was ours too. And my mom was so good at it. I think still now when I look back at it, she would every night she would fall asleep before she ended the story. So we would be waking her up, please mom, what is the end? And she's I'm already asleep. And then the next day she would tell us the ending of the story of so that is in her DNA. And when I discovered this and wanted to do something with this, because I think it started for me 4 years ago, and I have 6 brothers and they all have kids, and I really wanted to buy them a book that was representable, that it was with people like us, but not in a stereotype way, just being humans, just having adventures, books you were talking about, Matilda. It was this girl in a world where she doesn't really fits into, and then how she it's about resilience, and I wanted stories like that. So actually that was the beginning of Rose Stories, really wanting to make a book for my nephews and nieces, because I knew the thing is, growing up you don't know until you know, so you don't know that you miss it, but from the moment on you read a book with somebody that looks like you or has a background like you, has a name that sounds weird, that feeling is indescribable.
And what was the first book you got into your hands?
Well, to be honest, until I was 8, I was really, my mom was our storyteller, so her stories, and they were all fairy tales. And then when we came to the Netherlands in the 80s, it was just what we got in school. There's, when you're that young and you live in poverty, there's no money for buying books. So it was what the teachers would read to us. So it was I'm totally Roald Dahl, Witches, and Matilda, and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Those were amazing books, but I think looking at myself, it's more the characters in the books. If in a story Out of Africa or The House with the Spirits or Jane Eyre, anything like that with a woman that's resilient and doesn't give up, that really fascinated me.
So it's less about color or background, but more the characters that shape you, or is it both?
Does, but I remember the first time I could buy my own book, and I had a library card. I could rent my own books. It was a book, it's called Aimée. It's really poorly written, but it was about a Dutch Moroccan girl who fell in love with a Dutch boy. And I thought, oh, so we can fall in love with Dutch boys. So the market became much bigger.
That's an interesting discovery. Yeah. The power of books.
The power of books. Yeah, that's what I started. Well, 10 years later, dating Dutch guys. But because of that book, because I thought Dutch guys are not for us; they were for the Dutch girls, and we date Moroccan boys here in our community. But that's what books do. But also her having those wild curls, and also it was very stereotyped because her parents would really beat her to death while she was dating this guy. But to me, it was I recognize her curls, her adventurous, anything. And that was it made me so happy. And I think it was, when I was a grown-up, I asked the library, so was this well sold? And they said no, because most of these girls couldn't buy a book, but it was the most rented book in our where I lived. So, and most of us kept the book. So sorry.
So does that mean that like physical appearance in books and relating to characters that physically look like you is important?
It is. It is. And this was a stereotype story, but I think like when it's in books or in movies, and I remember watching Black Panther, the movie. I was with my brothers, and they were all like, "We feel something. This is weird to feel so happy to just see a story on this big screen. People that in some way look like you, but not. But like President Obama winning an election. It makes you, something happens in your head. You're like, if they can do it, I can do it.
So I wonder, like, I saw girls like me in books, but not all the time. I liked Matilda too a lot.
Yeah, we all do.
But so it's difficult for me to imagine how it is not to see yourself in books, but I heard a lot that it really makes a difference. But like for Joana,
from the other side of someone who's white and middle class and has always seen herself in books. I think you also read not just to see yourself, but to understand others. And so diversity is not just for people who are diverse, but also for us to understand our world. And I can also add like my favorite book when I was a kid.
Please do, because I forgot to ask you.
Because it was this comics from Brazil, Turma da Mônica. Almost everyone knows it. This is not something very alternative or groundbreaking, but the main character, Mônica, she's this girl who has super strength, and she's actually, depending on the story, sometimes she's the hero, but sometimes she's the villain, and she can be really violent. And at the time, when I was in primary school, this urge to beat boys when they were annoying you and having actually the strength to do it was really, it was a dream. Yeah, I'm not sure if it was empowering, but it connected to me on this deep level of like just wanting to get revenge. And I think, like kids are mean, and it reflected that on me.
Okay, maybe let's move to Aimée. Like, how important is it for you, or was it, or was? Because I wonder also, a lot of the times we always talk about children's books, because I'm convinced it's maybe even more important for children, but how is it as an adult to have books where you recognize yourself in one way or another? And how was it for you? How could you relate to characters in books or not? And
I think there was a definite lack of characters, and I think it is a privilege to be able to constantly see yourself, and it's not a privilege given to all. And so as I've grown older, I studied literature at university. I got into publishing straight out of university, and quickly noticed that I was one of 3 black people or 3 non-white people in an international office, and noticed that I was the first person of color to work in the editorial department of the company that I worked at. And so the landscape of everywhere that I was entering, despite my love of books, was extremely white and extremely middle class. And this fed through into what was being published. It fed through into the ideas for authors that should be approached for acquisition. And so for me, it became extremely frustrating to work in an environment where people had hired you on the basis of your expertise and your knowledge, and also your creativity and forward thinking, but had failed to see that what you could bring to the table wasn't being shaped or molded or able to flourish based on the very nature of what the office looked like. And so for me, I left traditional publishing to create a space where inclusive stories are told on the basis not of just oh, this person is a different skin color, and now let's create a book that talks about their skin color. Or this person is disabled, let's create a book that talks about their disability. Instead, the books that we publish at Nights Of are focused on great children's stories. One of our latest books is called Harriet versus the Galaxy, and features a young girl who wears a hearing aid, but the hearing aid enables her to hear the aliens that are going to overtake Earth, and so she's the only person that can translate and save the universe. Similarly, we have another story, Knights and Bikes, which features a young brown girl, but that is only mentioned once in the entire story, and the rest of the story is about two girls who enjoy riding bikes and fighting against monsters. And so, for me, it's very important to create stories and to find authors who are diverse, who want to create good stories and not so much focus on the fact that they are quote-unquote diverse, if that makes sense.
So it is important to avoid stereotypes,
Yeah,
even
for sure.
if you look back at it as a child, you had books that were very stereotypical and you were happy with that in a way, and you weren't really conscious of how wrong it sometimes was.
I think it is a problem that publishing can fall into, is that they say, oh, okay, we realize now that our list of authors isn't diverse. Let's get a Black, let's get an Asian, a Chinese author in, and let's get them to write a story that is Chinese or Indian or Black.
And does it still happen a lot?
I have heard, I've heard recently there was a report that came out in the UK from CLP, which showed that although there has been an increase from 1% to 4% of books published, that the quality of the stories has actually taken a downturn in terms of the fact of there's something they call the Jasmine effect, whereby any brown character is called Jasmine, and that's supposed to be an indicator of another race, or the fact that curly hair or tighter coiled hair, again, is meant to be an indicator of another race, and it's not good enough.
So it's kind of publishing houses seeing opportunities, but taking
but not
it
doing the work.
Yeah, not doing the work and take it too easy on themselves.
Yeah.
And so because in this panel we have invited two publishing houses, but your small independent publishing houses. And last year at the conference in Brussels we invited Penguin Random House UK to hear another side of the story. That's a huge publishing house that also does efforts to make their books more inclusive and work really with authors. But I always wonder about the relationship between the two. Like, what is the role of the independent publisher, and is the independent publisher necessary to do they have more freedom to work on inclusion, and are they less bound to the market? Or how do the both relate to one another?
I have mixed feelings about that. I think for the mission, it's really important that everybody does something with this. I mean, like we in the Netherlands, we really talk to big publishing houses to work together. But it's really hard because they're interested, but their main reason is the commercial interest. And so if an author doesn't sell well, they just drop him. So we would like we have this talent program where we train young new authors from various backgrounds. And then we introduce them to big publishing houses, because we cannot publish 10 books a year from new talents. But it's just, I mean, like, if a book doesn't sell, they will drop them. They don't have the time for the talent programs. This is hard for me, because in one way I'm like, we have to do this together. We need them for the mission. But for them, it's only interesting if it's commercial interesting, and that like breaks my heart sometimes.
Yeah, I was talking to Joana in the break because we hadn't met, and I just want to see who was going to be in the panel. And you told me about your first book, that was self-published and not published by a publishing house, and you brought it. It's about, maybe you should tell it yourself what it is about. The English title is James's Dresses, and the Portuguese one I will let you pronounce yourself.
It's a really small book, and it's simply about a boy who likes to wear dresses, and it's mainly just saying that and him showing all the dresses that he has had. And from the first to just enumerating all the dresses. I made it for a competition that happened just once here in Portugal. It was organized by ILGA Portugal, and they had a competition for children's books with LGBT themes, and I didn't win. And then afterwards, I was just out of university, and after making the book for the competition, I thought it was nice. So I printed it myself, and I started selling it or putting it in places or sending it to places, just as almost like a calling card as an illustrator, because I wanted to work with children's books. And since then, it's still selling. It's strange because I thought in the beginning, this is never gonna reach the kids I wanted to reach, because I didn't have any distribution or anything. I was just putting it in some galleries in Porto and then here in Lisbon. But yeah, like after 2 or 3 years, I started getting messages from parents or from people who were older, but they were telling me that they reminded them of their childhood. And so it's a book that I'm still selling, and now this year it got translated to English. But it's still not published by any publishing house. It's just me, and the English one, it's a guy who prints zines in Glasgow. So it's just one person going to zine fairs and selling it.
And it's your choice not to not to be looking for a publisher for that? Or?
In the beginning, I didn't think about it. I was just out of university, and I didn't even think that this would be a book that I could send to publishers, because I was young. And so I printed it myself. I know now that if I had sent it, I probably would have gotten it published here. But to be honest, I would probably would have made the same amount of money as selling it myself in places. Even if I just sold 800 copies, all the money comes to me. So as an author, it didn't make a big difference.
But it
Sorry,
was
publishers for me.
Yes, but
true.
it's quite interesting to hear. I have the feeling, talking to some young authors, that they don't restrict themselves anymore to publishing houses to reach a public, that it happens also in other ways, and to social media, or to that they find a public in other ways, because the role of a publishing house is in good editing, but also in distributing the book. So is there a change in the role of publishing houses, and how can it help other voices or other types of books to reach a public? Maybe, I don't know, who wants to answer that?
I think it's tricky, because I know a lot of non-white authors think that self-publishing is sometimes the easiest way, right? If you're not getting picked up by a publisher or a big publishing house, if you can't find a literary agent, then sometimes it's just easier and quicker to go straight to self-publishing. And there have been a few titles that I think have done really well in that space, and then they get actually eventually picked up by a publisher, and they blow up to be amazing big books. But I think sometimes the issue with those who self-publish is that they don't know the structure of publishing. And so maybe even just in the way that they are producing a book, it's immediately going to be seen as, there is this self-publishing and, published by a publishing house critique, I think. And some people do tend to look down on self-published books. And I think sometimes authors that choose that route and who do it badly can fall into that space where their book is then looked down upon. So even if the words inside are really good, the packaging and the way it's put forward can actually do them more of a disservice. And I think, again, that comes down to knowledge of knowing, what a cover should look like, or how a font should be set, or, margins, just the things that a traditional publisher will know, or even an independent publisher, the things that we will know in terms of packaging and how it should be, they fail on. And so it can do them more harm than good.
So it is an advantage to find your way to a publishing house and get it published there, I understand.
Yeah.
And
but then again, that's also very tricky, I think, because some authors don't know. I speak to lots of unpublished authors, debut authors, who don't know what a literary agent is, who don't know that sending out your submission to publishing houses can oftentimes be frowned upon if they don't like unsolicited. And so there's a problem there with certain communities not having the knowledge of how to approach publishing. So it's double-edged sword, I think.
So there is a need then to guide young authors and illustrators. And when I was at the conference in London, somebody said something that it was really spot on, I thought. Is like, we have to demystify the industry.
100%.
And I thought that was really well said, because it shows that for a lot of young authors and illustrators, it's something unreachable, because it's who has been in a publishing house except for the people that work there? I don't know. Others are like, you go into a library, in a bookshop, you know that, but a publishing house, it's something, even for me, and I worked for 6 years in the for Flanders Literature, for the fund that gives grants to authors and even to publishing houses, but I don't think I ever entered the offices. So, and that is a big threshold. And so, is it? How can that be changed? And would it help to get a more diverse palette of authors and illustrators? I don't know who wants to answer.
I have several ideas. No, but for example, I was mentioning that this book came out of a competition, so I think competitions can help bring up works from other people. I also think this is not I don't think this is about the publishing, but it's a bit about how it works to make a book. And I'm talking from my experience and from Portugal, and maybe it's a little different in other places. But here you have an idea, you write it and you draw it. I do both things. And then you send a draft to publishers, and they may want to publish you. Let's say they do. And then you work with a publisher to make the book better, and then it gets published and you get your money. And so it is a lot of months working for this thing that you're not, you have to have a safety net to be working on it, or you have another job, or you have all these other things. So if there aren't that many grants you can apply for it here, and if there was a system where things were a bit changed, or you get a bit of more support when you have an idea for a book, then more people could afford the privilege to be working on a book, on a longer project. And that would change a lot of things, I think.
So for you, the competition was a way of
also motivating a certain theme. Yeah. Maybe I wouldn't have think of writing this story if it wasn't because of the competition. In this case, it was really specific for diverse books. And it's a shame because it was only 1 year and they didn't do it again.
So I want to invite you all, actually. I haven't said it in the beginning of this discussion, but if you have ideas yourself, because to solve some of the issues and to find ways to make this whole book sector more inclusive, please join in. Just raise your hand and you can just pop in whenever. And at the end, we'll save some time also for questions. But if you really want to say something now, because otherwise you forget, just do so. Yeah. I don't know. Maria, sorry. Is there a... yeah. Okay. No problem. We can do with one.
Who was it? Sorry. Hi. About what you were talking about regarding support, I was reading a book about Ursula Nordstrom, the editor for Harper Books, and it's her letters to authors. And I knew this already, but not well. There was an advance once upon a time. Publishers paid an advance to authors in order to support them during the process of making the book. And I'm an illustrator. I've made books as well with publishers, and this never happened to me, of course. And what happens is, after you've finished it, the publisher, the ones I've worked with, they pay me a small advance, but after I've finished it, and then I get the royalties eventually. And what I was going to ask is, since we have publishers on the stage, what's their position regarding this? And I know small publishers have a harder time managing this possibility of having money beforehand. How do you deal with this need from the illustrators or the writers to not to have the time and availability to work on the book fully?
Okay. Who
Yeah, I
wants to go first? Maybe it's interesting to hear you both.
And so for us at Nights of, it's extremely important to make sure that we pay absolutely everybody, and that is both the people that we commission and also the people that we work with. So we don't hire interns on the principle that a lot of interns are unpaid. But to answer your question, we pay our authors and illustrators on signature of a contract, of delivery of the work, and then on publication of the work. And so there is a structure put in that the author will be, or illustrator will be paid before they deliver something, upon delivery, and then upon publication. I'm not sure if that is just a London thing.
Yeah, it's a Dutch thing too.
Yeah, so I think for us, there is a payment structure put in that serves and puts the needs of the author and illustrator at the forefront.
But it's the same for us. I mean, there are some rules, ground rules. I mean, nobody has to apply to them, but we try to do that. I mean, like it's a basic, how do you say, bedrag, amount, yeah, fee, a basic fee, and also how the royalties are settled. And that's hoe zeg je de auteursbond, the authors association. They set those rules. So we always try to apply those rules, but it's really hard, to be honest, and also to get into the competition with bigger publishing houses, so they have more to spend. And sometimes we try to talk with the author, especially people that are just starting and it's their first book, to see if we can do it in a different way, so to be more in like in a 50-50% percentage. So, because to me, this is such a, I don't want to call myself a publisher. I think it's a really crazy business. And in some sense, I mean, like you have to apply all the basic rules, but in some way I want to do it differently. Because I think we really have to look into that, to those basic rules. And I feel like most of the time it's in the benefit of the publisher and less in the benefit of the author. I think it should be more equally divided. But that's how I look into it. Maybe because I'm not a traditional publisher. Yeah, I find it really hard to have those conversations also with existing publishing houses.
Yes, but then I wonder, because I heard this from more in smaller independent publishing houses, that it's really not easy to survive in this context where you have the big ones that focus on commercial successes and even sometimes look out for interesting voices that are first published in the smaller independent houses that take the risks and that invest in diversity and that costs time and money and do coaching projects and so how can you secure yourself and as a smaller independent publisher to make sure that you can keep on doing the good work?
Can I make a point here?
Please do.
As an independent publisher, that was one point that I wanted to put forward in my presentation, but we didn't have time. So I'm really glad that someone is talking about grants and support here, on the one hand. On the other hand, and for example, in our case, in terms of paying the illustrators and authors in general, the fact is the big publishers don't pay better than we do. Maybe I don't know how they work, it doesn't matter. But I know from the experience of some of my illustrators that we usually pay them the double, or we give them, not that we pay them the double in the end, but at least we try to give an advance that is usually the double of what a big publishing house would pay them. And I try to be fair most of the times, but the thing is that we also have a limit, and we have very little resources, in the sense that I have many times paid the whole book to the authors, like paid the advance and the royalties, the whole thing, before even starting to sell the book, because I feel, whoa, you know, this is time, this is work, this is art. So how can we do it? But in Portugal, the print runs are usually very small comparing to other countries. So we have books that we have done originally with a Portuguese illustrator, for example, from which we make 1,500 copies. And the average print run is 2,000 copies. I mean, only Oliver Jeffers will do 4,000 or 5,000 in one print run. And that's an exception in the catalog. So it's hard for us, because usually in Portugal we pay around 8 to 10% royalties, but in the children's books it's really more 7 and 8% than 10%. And if there are two authors, a problem arises, because how much is each one going to earn? So many of our original projects, and you can look that for the first time the illustrator is writing, so he's also the writer. That means work from the editor, which is me, but that means as well that when we sell rights from those original projects, the author will make more money than the usual. So it's a way, it's a strategy in a way to make it bigger for everybody, let's say.
And would it be also a solution to work together as smaller publishers, like joining forces across the borders? Like if you would spread one book in different languages and get a bigger public by through a cooperation of smaller independent publishers?
That's a possibility. And we work with co-editions a lot in translations. We haven't done them when we sell rights of the books, because we just feel that we're not ready yet for it. It takes a lot of work, it takes people, everything. Anyway, going back to the support, I think everybody in this room must know that Portuguese publishers get zero support from our government. This is something that hasn't changed over the years. And this is something that is becoming very worrying, and especially worrying for an independent publisher who is trying to construct a catalog not based on recipes, not based on commercial objectives, and not based on using, like someone was saying, this idea of, like you were saying, this idea of diversity just to animate, you know, the context, the publishing context. Because as someone said, if the author is not selling, they will drop the author. And on the contrary, an independent publisher, and I think in that sense I can talk about, or I can talk for all independent publishers, that I know here, from Planeta, Tangerina to Pathologico, etc. We don't drop the author. We don't drop the book. We still love it. We still try to work it, to make it work, let's say. So we get grants. We don't get grants. The foreign publishers get grants to publish one of our Portuguese writers or illustrators abroad. And that's true that that's an incentive for the foreign publishers. And of course, that is also an advantage for us and the illustrator or writer. But it's not enough. That won't make our publishing context more diverse. It won't make it experimental. It won't make it different.
So it's the need to have space to experiment and to have the freedom of choice to invest in different kind of authors. And I know we're not going to solve this now, but and it's addressed actually to Ministry of Culture, maybe in all the different countries. Maybe, yeah.
Because I think it's really key to have support. I think for us. Well, Suzanne is over here for Cora. She's from the Dutch Foundation for Literacy. And with Agnes.
So Suzanne.
Yeah, hi Suzanne.
Money for the...
No, we already get money from. That's why we still exist. But like I remember like a year ago, I was like really almost crying saying, I'm going to quit. And I think it really, if it wasn't for their help, we would have already stopped. Because it's really so challenging to keep it going. And you make books and you invest in talents. And it's really... It's not always like paying back. It's paying back in impact. So you get a lot of attention from the press. You get to talk everywhere. But it doesn't really multiply in money. So you can make other books. I think for us to really still exist, especially the publishing side of us, is really because of the Dutch fund. So I think, yeah, that's really important. Totally understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, the question is what the situation is like in the UK.
So the Arts Council exists, and it exists. Literature is increasingly becoming something that they are focusing on, although Arts Council historically has an emphasis on the arts, not including literature, so theatre, performance, etc. And so they are currently restructuring the way you can apply for grants for literature, but most of it is done independently out of your own funds. And so we don't even consider the opportunity of grants. And so if you are publishing in the UK, in London, it's out of your own pocket and or investment that you have managed to raise. So it's not a government-supported initiative. There is support for individual authors and illustrators, but on the whole, as an industry, publishing isn't supported by the government at all.
But I have here, maybe I can mention it now, like the Arts Council made this report recently, Time for Change. It pinpoints the challenges that are still lying ahead to make the book industry more inclusive. So in a way, it's not investing directly money into the sector, but I think it's also not unimportant that they take up this role.
They're aware. We have a good relationship at home with the Arts Council, and they have for a few years been trying to change, even down to language and wording. A lot of their grants are focused on how many performances a creative will do, and for literature that just doesn't apply, it doesn't relate at all. And so they are aware they need to restructure the way that the grants will be accessed for those who do exist in a literature space. The report is great, but that needs to be put into action.
Yeah. So and if they publish this, they should also take responsibility themselves and invest. That's your message.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. In a nutshell,
that's clear.
Well, that's, I think, the challenge is how to get from this great article to people really doing things. And especially, I mean, when we started like 4 or 5 years ago, there wasn't much around inclusion in children's books, as far as I could see. But like getting from nowhere to something is really challenging. You know, getting people to really move and doing things. I think that's a question to all of you. How do we get there? I mean, because there are so many great articles. Like so many great talks, and everybody's talking about it. But I'm really conflicted by like, how do we all together set the next step? And you said to me like, I don't know. We were talking about. Have things changed? And I was like, I think 2 years ago we met through Susanne, and we started talking about this European project. And to me, like in my first of mind, I was like, no, nothing has changed in the past 2 years. But I'm like, we are sitting here all together talking about this topic, and I'm really wondering, because I'm happy with that, but also how to take the next step, how to do things. So that's it's not an answer, but it's more a question to all of us. How do we do that?
Yes, that's the question we want to get answers to throughout this project. I think also, and then I will give you I think within the European project, there's definitely a possibility to take a next step. But I also feel that we're with 6 countries where the context is different and they're not the same. How do you say that, speed or same, they're not at the same point. So I don't think there's one solution that suits all those countries, but that makes it also interesting. We can learn from each other. And like even in the UK, I always think like, oh, in the UK a lot is happening, but there is still a lot to be done also.
There is a lot to be done.
So yeah, there's
different challenges in every country, I think.
Yeah.
And I think it's very typical of London, or even the UK, to have all of the conferences, have all of the panels, to have all of the discussion, and then everybody leaves and they feel really amped up and like energized, and then it leads to nothing. And I think that is an issue that we are not paying attention to. I was talking with a colleague and I said, I wish that all of the money that I get paid to sit on panels to talk about diversity was actually put into hiring somebody in an office. And I think that is how you make actual difference, is putting people in positions of power.
Yeah,
it's all about representation.
so, and it is a power shift that is needed. I will give the word to you now.
I was listening when we were talking about self-publishing, then independent editors, mainstream editors, and I was going to ask you about international agents and their role on bringing up diversity, making possible for me to read a story from other country and a different language. But now I change my question and ask, what about supporting translations to bring up diversity?
And so the question would be then to support translations of inclusive books, then
to support translations, to make possible for us to read each other's books, different books written from different people from different places, and the role of translations and the publishing the not mainstream books, just sharing stories from the world.
Yeah, I think there are instruments, because as a Flanders Literature we do invest in translations, but not with a specific scope or focus. It's just to get the Flemish books out there in the world, and so. But maybe it's interesting to hear how it goes in other countries.
So for Nights Of, we are represented by the Intercontinental Literary Agency, and they sell our books across the EU, and are active in the conversation around diversity as well. And so they are constantly pushing and promoting and trying to get our books sold into different territories. When it comes the other way around, those are relationships that we as a very tiny publisher have to first make with European publishers. And so we've been at Bologna for the past few years, and it is a relationship thing, and we find that foreign publishers will obviously send to the UK publishers that they have those relationships with first and foremost, and then maybe you're on the second or you're on the third wave when they're sending something out. And so for us, we are just trying to create long-lasting relationships with foreign publishers first and foremost, and to get them to even know that we exist, and vice versa.
Chafina, do you want to add on that, or
Do you want me
shall,
to add on
shall
that?
I ask you not a difficult
You can-
question?
Oh yeah, I love
No,
the difficult
or an easy
questions.
one. An easy one.
No, I just wanted to say, for us, the most successful book we have was a translation. So that's that was really funny, because that was the easiest to do, and then like that was the most successful. So my brother said, "Oh, you started a publishing house, and after 3 years, your most successful book is a translation." Wow, well done. But it was, yeah. I think that could be really, especially when it's very universal. I mean, like when it comes to gender, those kind of topics. Because inclusion is like, I think it's all about representation, and inclusion is different in every country. I mean, like inclusion in Morocco, I'm like the majority when I'm back there with my parents, and other people, I mean, like the migrants of sub-Saharan migrants are the migrants. It's very difficult to set it in stone what inclusion is. It's for every country different. But when it comes to gender, that's more like a something that's all over the world. So it's more mainstream, and it's easier to translate those kinds of books. But yes, definitely, especially now with the trend on gender and like the amazing women, like the 50 amazing women we have all over the world.
And is it a danger that it becomes a trend, and then
it is
that
a trend?
disappears?
I think it's beyond the trend, but it still works. And when we see books like Bedtime Stories for Rebel Girls, it's been all over the world. It's been translated 50 times. It's almost sold more than 10 million books. I don't think it's beyond the trend, but it still holds strong. So you see the necessity and the need of a lot of people to see themselves back, especially women. And I think also for young boys to see strong women.
So it's a good thing.
It's a great thing, but nobody in the Netherlands, nobody wanted it because they said women.
A hype.
A book about women, who's going to buy that? Yeah. Well, a lot of people.
Maybe,
I'm sorry. I have to understand what we are talking about inclusion, because inclusion is not only to be represented, it's to have access to other realities.
Yeah.
So I think we are talking about people to be represented, and I think we had a lot to talk about, because it's not only about if Joana was telling that she wrote stories that were her own, or that we have to create education, or the education has to create possibilities for people from other realities to create their own stories. So that's a first point. And the other point is how to create accessibility to people to get to know other stories from other realities. And so when we talk about inclusion, I think we have to keep in mind that we are talking about a lot of things.
Yes, that's true. And sometimes that makes it difficult to focus on a specific thing.
Because about self-representation, I don't see, because people need to be self-represented. I know my reality, people with intellectual disabilities know their reality, people with motor impairments know their reality, and they are not represented.
Yeah, that's the word power shift was mentioned here.
So when we have to create the opportunities for other kind of authors to create their own stories and realities. So when we have to keep in mind that it's not about to be represented, but to get access to other representation.
Yeah, thank you for that remark, because it's really important indeed to keep that in mind, that it's just not what is visible in books and the stories that are told, but also who writes them and who publishes them and who gets... And who's going to read them also, because that was actually my next question, my next difficult question. No, because in the afternoon there will be a panel that will focus more profoundly on the part of the readers, and there will be also reading promoters, libraries, but I want also in this panel to ask the question, like, what do you feel as the responsibility of a publishing house, of an author, to get connected with your reading public, and how do you think about it, and how do you take that into account when you decide what to publish or what is needed?
I think publishing sometimes has a bad habit of expecting readers to find stories, whether that be in traditional spaces such as bookshops or at literature conventions or festivals. And as a company, we have always been trying to find a way to access readers where they are, as opposed to expecting them to come and find our books. So the area I grew up in, Lewisham, to this day doesn't have a bookshop, doesn't have a traditional bookshop space. So my mother, as a child, would take me to the next town over just to make sure I could sit in a bookshop for hours and read. And so as we're constantly searching now as a company to find a way to access readers where they are, we ran a pop-up inclusive bookshop for the course of 5 days, located in Brixton, and we managed to sell over 500 books in those 5 days. And the bookshop only stocked titles that were written by Black, Asian, or minority ethnic authors and or illustrators. And from that, the community then told us, they asked us, why aren't you here permanently? How can we ensure that you are here permanently? What do we have to do to support you in having a permanent space in a town that is going through gentrification? And so we went away and we came back a few months later, and we ran a crowdfund campaign to open an inclusive bookshop in the heart of the town that was crying out for it. And 4 months ago, we opened Brixton's only permanent children's bookshop that stocks only inclusive titles. And I take your point on when you say that we have to be careful about the definitions that we use. And as a company, we use inclusion and the term diversity in the widest forms. I think oftentimes I am hyper aware of the fact that I sit up here as a Black woman and people see me and they think the representation I speak of is only for Black people. And that is an assumption that is made by the people that sit in the chairs. I'm not saying in this room, but in many rooms that I've been in, that's an assumption that people in the chairs make, and is not the definition which we rule by. So for us, our diversity is socioeconomic mobility, it's disability, it's race, gender, and familial structure. And that is something that we have had set in stone from day one. And so opening a bookshop, to circle back around, in Brixton has meant that we can serve the community which really is crying out for inclusive titles. And we get as many white parents as we do non-white parents who say to us, these are books that my child needs because they go to school or they're in friendship groups where their friends are not the same as them, and yet their friends are never in the books that they read. And so we are very proud to have a space that doesn't sell traditional children's books, traditional by the terms of the industry, I guess. We don't stock the famous titles. We only stock inclusive titles, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question, because sometimes for us working on this topic, it's so obvious. Also within the European project, we specifically focused. The word inclusion now. It's used in a lot of different ways. So, and what Aimée said, is the way we use it also in the context of the project, that it's it's about different kinds of aspects of your individuality, and not only just one aspect of that. And it's not only, and it's good. Yeah, that she mentions as a Black person, that she's seen as it's also something how the mind works, I think. That you think, okay, she's here to represent a certain kind of group, but happy to hear that you're not. So I think, are there any more questions from the audience or? But I found it very interesting that Carla also mentioned as a publishing house being involved in a bookshop, and so it's like the traditional roles of the separate roles of you have an author, publishing, and the chain is changing, and maybe there's also a solution in a way to find another way of connecting with the public or the readers. But I will let you.
Okay. Hello, good morning. Cristiane from the Natural History Museum, University of Lisbon. I would like to have the feedback for the one that writes and illustrates. What's the barriers that you find for the ideas that you have, for the potentials that you have as professional in this area? Because I think in the end we are looking for a fair society. Doesn't matter the topic, we are looking for a fair society. So it's your point of view as a writer and an illustrator.
But the barriers I find as
I'm
working,
exactly.
I was really lucky, so I usually don't get any. I haven't had a lot of barriers in my life. So so far, I've managed to publish everything that I've made. If I couldn't publish it in a traditional way, I found ways to do it self-publishing. The biggest barrier is distribution, as with any publisher would also tell, because it's hard to put things for sale in places. So I would need another person just to take care of that. But yeah, that was the only barrier so far. As a creative, because I'm dealing with people who are also like small publishers and more alternative, I never got censored in any way. Yeah, I was lucky, I think.
Yeah, we only have one author on the panel. Maybe there's other authors in the audience that have other experiences. But I think there's another question. There's an author. Not an author. Someone with a solution or a question.
I wish. I'm working on it. I already asked a question to Carla, but I didn't present myself. I'm Marta from Pathologic. I'm an editorial assistant. And I would like to add another word, since we're talking about representation and inclusion. I think what made me fall in love with books was their ability to create empathy. So when I read, I'm in a happy marriage, but when I read Madame Bovary, I feel her angst and I feel her disappointment in her life. If I see a movie like 12 Years of Slavery, I'm a privileged white woman, but I can feel his pain. So I think the most important thing about stories, and we're talking about that every story matters, is that we have the ability to learn more from other perspectives and to empathize with other people. And I don't know if you're on social media, but you will find that there's a huge lack of empathy. So I find that stories in any way and form, books, movies, theater, help us to create this idea of universal values, like Carla told us about, that the importance of including other people, including their perspectives, and knowing that our truth is not the only truth out there. So I just wanted to add another point of our discussion, which is very
Interesting.
So, yeah, important word,
Thank you.
empathy. And I think it has already been mentioned that it's not only necessary to see yourself in books, but also to have windows to look out on the world and to see.
I remembered something from my other answer. I'm sorry, just to add one thing, because I was telling you that I've never felt censored, but I remember that I worked for a year in Lithuania, and it's a country in the European Union that still has a law that you cannot publish things for children that represents ideas of a family that's not a traditional family as written in the Constitution. And this is a law that still exists. They're still trying to battle it. And some books for children have been censored there. And while I was working there, I was working in an LGBT association there. I wasn't making children's books back then, but it was a problem there that we could not put posters on walls in the streets about things from other kinds of families because we could get fined. So it's an example that's still happening in Europe.
So I understand on the level of society, there's still a lot of work to be done on a general level, like to make everybody sensitive. But we have 50 more minutes, so I want to focus now on the concrete solutions or ways of working on inclusion. So we mentioned some, but I will let each of you say one or two instruments that you think that would be really, really useful to make the book industry, or from the part in the afternoon we will talk more about what the role of the libraries and other distributors of books can be, but what is the most important? Do we need quota? Do we need concrete tips or guidelines? Do we need a charter? Do we need an encompassing strategy, a change of attitudes? Do we need more role models? And try to make it as concrete as possible, like one or two things, like, okay, if we have this and this, then in 1 year, 2 years, we will notice the difference, and we will have other books on the bookshelves in the houses of people, in the libraries, in the bookstores. Maybe that's a difficult question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Well, I think I've said it earlier. I think even bigger publishers, they actually want diversity in their books. That's why we were talking about how that book of The Stories for Rebel Girls is such a big success trend. But the problem is that it's also a book that is very superficial and quickly done, and maybe not that great.
Yeah. So a crash course for publishing houses or on what real inclusive books are?
No, I'm just saying that there is a trend, so actually there's need for this kind of books. So maybe I'm still biased because I'm an author. I'm saying like you need to find this real support for the authors of these books, and not just to buy something that's pretending to be diverse or feminist, and it's not actually.
Because the authors that are writing those books and are willing to tell those stories, they're there, but they need to find their way to the publishing houses, and publishing houses need to be more...
Publishing houses want them, I think.
Yeah.
They just need to support the people who will write actually good books, I think. This is...
So if the publishing houses want them and the authors are there, what is still missing?
Are they there? They need to find them. I think that's that.
Yeah, competition?
You have to find the authors. You have to create the opportunities for people to show their work. I'm not an author. I work with people with disabilities. But you have to find a way for people to show their work. people that they are not in schools, for example, because here in Portugal, for some people to get other kind of scholarship, you need to be from a social background that is favorable. So you need to create opportunities.
It's not just showing the work, but creating the conditions for that work to happen.
To happen and to create and education. You have to start from schools.
Yeah. So
There's
within the European project, I'm asking because this is the kick-off conference of Every Story Matters. We should focus on finding solutions and show them how authors, you mentioned that this competition was really useful, or you have coaching projects in the industry or things like that, or is that all, has that all been done, and is that not sufficient? But it's an important issue to tackle. So if we within the project, we are going to create also with people books that are an example, like to show how that are the kind of books that are still lacking, or perspective that are still lacking too much. I think that's a good thing, but will it convince publishing houses all over Europe to take this step and invest in other voices, or do we need to do more?
It's a kind of, it's always the same access. I think it's the bridge, because sometimes to commission books on a certain theme, as we've already said this morning, it comes from a commission. It doesn't come from the heart, like Marta said. Empathy, you empathize when somebody's telling about something deeply rooted. So it's again, find those people not commissioned to some others, find access. I think we are in a conference, Acesso Cultura in Portugal has made a lot in terms of arts for us all to think about access, and it's the right partner in Portugal. There's all around works done, and they are hidden because people don't have access. So it's more a bridge. I think my partner here, she has something.
Yeah, go ahead.
In the microphone.
I can't wait for the next one, because I would go back, and you were asking for real solutions. So I'll just
maybe they are not there yet. We still have to.
But I must say that I'm not from Portugal. I'm from Brazil, and I'm an author there, published there. But to see, I feel like I'm outside of a bubble here, because to see that you are so committed to do this, and you're already doing. I see that Carla is fighting battles for books that are different, and this is so much more than has been done, at least in Brazil, for example. So trying to respecting the author and paying, and I've never been paid. It's just you're in the right track, you know.
So maybe make those good examples more visible, and the models they use and how they.
Yes, exactly, and contests, and if you are looking for it and you are already doing something, it's already so much more, and I'm amazed. I actually am amazed, because to me it's my hobby. It will never be my profession in Brazil. So
okay, thank you.
That's it.
I don't know. There's one more question. I will look. It's like 8 minutes. 8 minutes and 2 more questions.
I'll be quick. The first thing I think it is to be conscious, and maybe in this room, and that's why people come here, it's because they're interested. So, and there are people doing things, like you're all doing things. I'm doing things, Pato is doing things, teachers are doing things. So the first thing is to acknowledge. The second thing that you were asking, but how do we do this? And I think this has to come from all of us. And so these encounters are very important, and I think this is amazing that we are doing something here in Lisbon, in Portugal. We should do it in other cities or other places in the country. But there is one thing about editors, and I'll speak as an editor, is that, yeah, you can commission things, Dora. And you can ask people to talk, not commission in the sense of, or I can ask an illustrator. Let's give an example. I can ask an illustrator and say, look, my preoccupations at this time are this. I want to speak about modern families. Do you want to do something about this? Do you want to think about something? I don't want the recipe in the book. I don't want a pedagogical thing. You know, I want a story that in the middle has this image, convey this kind of representation. So new family structure. And the illustrator answers, I want to do a book about time. And I said, fine. So this is not for you. And I keep going. But with the books that I work with, like Troca Tintas, True Colors that you saw, we worked on many things. So there's many little things actually in the book and in the text and in the images and in the representation of people that come not from the illustrator, but from a discussion with the editor. So yes, we can do something about it, I think. And the readers can do something about it, like I said before. And I'll shut up because I think
Aimée wants to quickly respond to that.
I just think we have to be very careful about who we ask to create certain stories, because there is oftentimes a nuance that can be lacking and missing when we ask a majority to write the stories of a minority. And that's my first point on that. Yeah, no, I just think sometimes it is painted as the quick solution is to get the majority of authors to write the stories of people from within communities that aren't their own. And I think there is a massive danger. And I often get asked by white authors, oh, I just, I want to help. How can I now write the stories of communities that I don't belong to? And when I ask them why they want to do that, I think they then have to interrogate the why and the experience they have within those communities or not. To answer your question on how do we make changes, permanent changes, I think for us, hiring, and I mean that in the widest sense, is our solution. It is putting people, authors, illustrators, publicists, those who work in rights, those who work in accounts, in positions of power to have the conversations that are oftentimes not being had. As I mentioned in the very beginning, I worked in an office where I was one of 3 people of colour, and until I was there, these conversations were not being had. So I don't think that we can rely on the current state or the current demographics of publishing to make those permanent changes. I think we have to open our doors, demystify the process, and get people from within these diverse communities to work within our offices. Not to say that it is our entire responsibility to publish diverse voices, but we have to have the conversations behind the scenes before we can see any changes on the shelves.
So having people with different backgrounds in the offices
in the
is even more
as
important,
well.
or even equally important as
sure.
having to have books published by other voices, and is even equally important to having a different representation in books. It's all different parts of what we are working on together. I don't know if there is one more final question. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I already had the microphone. I'm sorry. I wanted to speak about an example in Brazil, which I think is very valuable. And I don't know the details, so I'm just going to mention it. There's Editora Mino, which is a comics publisher. And they make comics for mostly young adults, but comics can reach children as well. And they have a program. Suddenly, last year, I think they started a program, and they're a small publisher, where they, in their own homes, they're a couple. They invited a few teenagers or young adults from underprivileged communities in Brazil to come and have an intensive workshop for I'm not sure how long, with the intention of preparing them as authors for publishing. So they're consciously giving them the opportunity, which they would not have any other way, to do what they want to do the most, which they wouldn't be able to do through usual education, public education means.
Okay, thank you. I think, yeah, I hear a lot of hopeful examples. Sulafa, that was the last question, but is it she's a partner. She's my partner, so I have to let her say what she has to say.
It's a privilege of being a partner. Yeah. Now, I wanted to talk about the inclusion because since we were established, since I was a partner in this project, the inclusion term was a very confusing part for me. Even I want to talk about my background, which is always hard to put your background in the conversation, but I'm coming from Syria and I live in Berlin. And we always face this idea about also, like, for example, immigrant representation, or like working with children about like what is it to be inclusion. And there's like a fine line between using inclusion as accessories, like, or stereotyping way of an easy recipe about what is it, or it's a process. So what I find like about, for example, inclusion is not about like including disability or like gender issues or like people of color or like immigrants' stories and say, okay, those are stories of those people. It's more of a process. And this process, it could be in different ways. For example, who wrote the stories is very important, that who has the access and the tools of saying the stories. And if we want to encourage the inclusion storytelling, is we have to encourage different communities of having the tools and the access of telling stories. Or this is one thing, and the other thing is like to encourage the independent sectors who are trying to make experimental, as we said, like experimental storytellings outside of the mainstream commercial line. So I think like the inclusion is not a recipe, it's not an accessory, it's a process of how we make the story, or we access those who don't have the access of saying their stories. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think to conclude, Sulafa will be a great partner within the project, because we're doing a process. This is only the start of looking for more and durable solutions. And if you, Yannick told briefly what within the project we will do, but Sulafa will have in Berlin in schools also workshops with children to feed into their stories and to feed authors also with other stories. We will have library workshops in Portugal, and we will be also on the book fairs, because we think it's very important to be present there and work on visibility and getting the publishers more involved. So there's really different kinds of aspects, but I think it has been very useful to hear you all, and thank you Chafina and Joana and Aimée for being here and sharing your thoughts with us and your ideas, and for everybody joining in the discussion. Let's hope that we can make more changes the coming years. Thank you.